History is full of battles, but some of them are legendary. We're talking about wars that changed the world, commanders who pulled off insane strategies, and soldiers who fought against impossible odds. From brutal tank clashes to ancient warriors standing their ground, today we will talk about 8 of the most epic battles in history. And trust us, you don't want to miss this. Let's get into it. In June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan aimed to eliminate the U.S. as a Pacific power by capturing Midway Atoll. They planned to lure the U.S. fleet into a trap and destroy it, aiming to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific. Sounds foolproof, right? Well, not exactly. Japan didn't know that the U.S. had cracked their secret codes. American intelligence had figured out where and when the attack would happen, meaning the U.S. wasn't walking into a trap. They were setting one. When Japan launched its first wave of attacks on June 4th, they thought they had the upper hand. Their planes bombed Midway Island while their aircraft carriers stayed safely in the background. But while they were busy celebrating, the U.S. had 3 aircraft carriers hidden nearby, waiting to strike. Then came one of the most insane, high-risk attacks in history. American dive bombers flying through chaos caught the Japanese completely off guard. In a matter of minutes, they turned the tide of the war. Literally, a boom! One Japanese carrier explodes. Boom! Another one's on fire. Boom! A third one is sinking. By the end of the battle, 4 of Japan's best aircraft carriers were at the bottom of the ocean. This battle changed everything. Before Midway, Japan had been steamrolling through the Pacific. But after losing 4 carriers and hundreds of their best pilots, they were on the back foot for the rest of the war. The U.S. now had the advantage and started its island-hopping campaign, which would eventually lead to victory in the Pacific. And just like that, Midway went from being a speck in the ocean to the turning point of World War II. We are now traveling back to the year 1815, to a battlefield where empires were at stake, legendary commanders clashed, and a single day of fighting reshaped Europe. By 1815, Napoleon had already been defeated and exiled to a tiny island, Elba. But because he was Napoleon, he escaped, returned to France, and in just a few weeks built another army. He planned to strike before his enemies could unite. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington near the village of Waterloo in Belgium. Wellington's army held the high ground, making it a defensive nightmare for the French. Napoleon launched a massive artillery bombardment, then sent in infantry waves. The British formed squares, tight defensive formations that resisted even the most brutal French cavalry charges. Then Napoleon played his trump card, the Imperial Guard. These elite soldiers were considered nearly invincible, having rarely faced defeat in battle. He sent them forward for a final attack, expecting to break Wellington's line. But instead, the British held firm and counterattacked. And then, disaster struck. The Prussians arrived. With fresh troops smashing into his flank, Napoleon's army panicked and fell apart. Soldiers fled, and what was once a mighty army crumbled. A few weeks later, Napoleon surrendered. This time, there was no escape. He was sent to St. Helena, a remote island in the middle of the Atlantic, where he lived out the rest of his days in exile. You've heard stories about the Battle of Thermopylae, but did you know the real battle was even more unbelievable? A small Greek force stood against an army so massive it shook the earth, and they held their ground. How did they do it? And why is this battle still talked about 2,500 years later? Let's find out. This was the legendary Battle of the 300 Spartans, but in reality they weren't alone. Around 7,000 other Greek soldiers stood with them. Still, they were outnumbered at least 20-1 against the massive Persian army. King Xerxes of Persia brought one of the largest forces the world had ever seen to invade Greece. But the Greeks had a plan. They chose to make their stand at Thermopylae, a narrow pass where numbers wouldn't matter as much. For 3 days, they held off wave after wave of Persian attacks, slaughtering thousands. Then came the betrayal. A Greek traitor showed Xerxes a hidden path through the mountains, letting the Persians attack from behind. The Greek army had no choice but to retreat, except for King Leonidas, his 300 Spartans, and a contingent of Thespians who chose to stay and fight to the end. They stayed and fought to the last man, refusing to surrender. Their sacrifice lit a fire in Greece. Inspired by their bravery, the Greek city-states united, and not long after they crushed the Persian invasion. Thermopylae proved that courage and strategy could stand against overwhelming odds. Alexander the Great versus the Persian Empire. It was one man against an entire empire, and somehow he won. Darius III, the Persian king, had the numbers. His army was way bigger than Alexander's. Some say 5 times bigger, but numbers don't win battles, strategy does. Alexander knew he couldn't just charge in. Instead, he studied Darius's formation. He noticed gaps in the Persian lines, small weaknesses that he could exploit. So what did he do? He used his cavalry to draw the Persians outward, stretching their formation. Then, he sent his best troops straight through the gap toward Darius himself. Darius panicked and ran, just like he did in their last battle. And when the king runs, his army follows. The Persian forces collapsed, and Alexander won the battle and the empire. With Persia defeated, Alexander became one of the greatest conquerors in history, and all of it started with brilliant strategy and a fearless charge. Gaugamela ended an empire, but Gettysburg shaped a nation. Stay tuned for heroic last stands, brutal fighting, and one of the most famous speeches in history. And if you're enjoying this exploration of history's greatest battles, remember to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. This was the battle that changed everything in the American Civil War. Up until this point, the Confederates had been winning, and their legendary general Robert E. Lee was pushing north into Union territory. If Lee won at Gettysburg, the Union might have been forced to negotiate peace. For 3 brutal days, July 1st through 3rd, 1863, both sides clashed in the hills and fields of Pennsylvania. The fighting was intense, with soldiers battling in streets, forests, and rocky ridges. The Union held the high ground, making it tough for Lee's forces to break through. On the 3rd day, Lee ordered 12,000 men to march across an open field, straight into Union artillery and rifle fire. Thousands fell within minutes, and the Confederate attack collapsed. By the time the battle was over, Lee's army was forced to retreat. They never recovered from the losses, and from that point on, the South was on the defensive. Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. The Union gained the upper hand, and Lincoln later gave the Gettysburg Address, one of the most famous speeches in history. If you thought Gettysburg was intense, wait until you hear about the largest tank battle the world has ever seen. Our next battle involves thousands of tanks, brutal close combat, and a clash so massive it shook the entire Eastern Front. Kursk was the biggest armored clash in history. Thousands of tanks, millions of soldiers, and an all-out fight on the Eastern Front that changed the course of World War II. It was July 1943. Hitler was still reeling from the disaster at Stalingrad, but instead of playing it safe, he decided to go big. His plan resulted in Operation Citadel, a massive German offensive to cut off a bulge in the Soviet lines near the city of Kursk. The idea was simple: attack from the north and south, trap the Red Army inside, and deliver a much-needed German victory. But the Soviets saw it coming a mile away. Instead of waiting to be caught in a trap, they turned Kursk into a fortress. They built the biggest defensive line ever seen. It was like they had built a medieval castle, but with machine guns and tanks instead of moats and knights. On July 5th, 1943, the Germans launched their attack. At first, they made progress. Their Tiger tanks rolled forward, infantry pushed through, and it looked like Hitler's plan might work. But then, the Soviets unleashed hell. Airstrikes, artillery, tank traps, and ambushes. The Germans lost men and machines just to move a few miles. The deeper they pushed, the worse it got. Every time they broke through one defensive line, another one was waiting. Then came July 12th, the most famous part of Kursk, Prokhorovka. Over 1,500 tanks clashed in an open field, and it turned into pure chaos. Tanks fired at point-blank range because the smoke and dust made it impossible to see. Some tanks rammed straight into each other because there was no time to maneuver. The Germans threw everything they had at Kursk, and it wasn't enough. They lost too many tanks, too many men, and most importantly, the element of surprise. By August, they had no choice but to retreat, and the Soviets counterattacked hard, pushing the Germans back. Kursk was the beginning of the end for Germany on the Eastern Front. Hitler was so shaken by this battle that he canceled all future German offensives. That's how bad Kursk was for him. Now we have one of the deadliest battles in modern history, Verdun. The longest battle of World War I, and possibly the most nightmarish. Verdun was Germany's plan to bleed France dry. The Germans launched the attack, believing that if they could bleed the French army dry, France would collapse. Verdun, a city with deep historical significance to the French, was chosen because they knew the French would fight to the death to defend it. And they did. For 10 months, the battle raged. Artillery shells rained down non-stop, turning the battlefield into a wasteland of craters and corpses. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Soldiers lived in trenches filled with mud, rats, and death, fighting for mere yards of land. But the French never broke. "They shall not pass," became their rallying cry. Despite suffering enormous losses, they held the line and eventually pushed the Germans back. In the end, over 700,000 soldiers were killed or wounded, making it one of the deadliest battles in history. Verdun was a trial by fire for the French and their morale, but Stalingrad was pure hell on earth. A battle of snipers, starvation, and brutal street fights? This one was personal. If hell had a location on Earth, it was Stalingrad. This battle was a nightmare. Hitler wanted to take the city as a symbolic victory, while Stalin ordered his men to hold it at all costs. What followed was one of the most brutal urban battles in history. Soldiers fought in the streets, in ruined buildings, and even in the sewers. At one point, German soldiers said they controlled 90% of the city, but the Soviets refused to break. Then, in a genius move, they launched Operation Uranus, surrounding the Germans. The Soviets trapped the German 6th Army inside the city. With winter setting in and supplies running out, the Germans were doomed. In early 1943, they surrendered. Nearly 100,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, and most never came back. After Stalingrad, Germany was never the same. It was the beginning of the end for Hitler's army, and that wraps up 8 of the most epic battles ever fought. War is brutal, but these battles shaped history in ways that still affect the world today. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more history like this, and let us know in the comments which battle you think was the most epic. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.